I'd like to call this markup to order. I'm pleased to be here today to advance two important pieces of legislation: the Transparency and Regulatory Analysis of Impacts on the Nation Act, which is referred to as the TRAIN Act, and the Jobs and Energy Permitting Act. The TRAIN Act was introduced by Vice Chairman Sullivan and Representative Matheson, both members of this committee, which would require a cumulative impact study on over 14 regulations being proposed by the Obama administration that would have a major impact on our economy and jobs. EPA has begun one by one to look at some of the impacts of these regulations. We know that they've looked thoroughly at the benefits of these regulations. As an example, the utility rule proposed by EPA last month is estimated to add $10.9 billion a year to the cost of generating electricity. EPA predicts that this rule alone will increase electricity prices as much as 7% in some parts of the nation. Many studies assess this rule at a much higher cost and impact on electricity prices. Later this year, EPA expects to issue the transport rule, imposing a federally enforceable plan to further regulate electricity generating facilities. EPA estimates that this rule will cause electricity prices to increase another 3%. EPA also proposed to revise the new ozone standard that was just issued in 2008, and they're revisiting that already. EPA estimates that revising the ozone rule would cost $90 billion, which undoubtedly would be passed along in electricity prices. Earlier this year, EPA also issued new ambient air quality standards for sulfur dioxide emitted from coal-burning power plants and also for nitrogen oxide. Soon, EPA will be reviewing revisions to the standards for fine particulate matter. These rules also will be increasing energy prices. The analysis by EPA did not look at the cumulative impact of the rules, nor did it look at how these rules would affect global competitiveness, jobs in all sectors of the economy, and prices that consumers pay for American-made products. The TRAIN Act would give us some methodology for looking at the cumulative economic impact of these types of regulations. The second piece of legislation before us today is the Jobs and Energy Permitting Act of 2011, which was introduced by Representative Cory Gardner. This bill would give us access to vast quantities of new oil supplies in Alaska and help to bring that oil online in the years ahead. That it has taken one energy producer over 5 years to obtain a clean air permit for discovery exploration in the outer continental shelf is unprecedented, even for EPA. The estimates of oil available in the OCS are very promising. In fact, it could replace all of our imports from Saudi Arabia. But the federal red tape preventing that potential from being realized poses a daunting challenge for the American people. Some estimates suggest that oil production in the Beaufort and Chukchi Sea in Alaska could reach 1 million barrels per day should adequate infrastructure develop over time. According to the University of Alaska, it could offset foreign oil imports by 7%, creating 40,000 to 50,000 jobs annually and provide a vital source of additional throughput for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, one of our most important and significant oil arteries in North America. So what we're doing today is very important as we try to take additional steps to become more energy independent. And I would urge all members to work with us to advance these two important pieces of legislation. And once again, I'd like to thank Representative Cory Gardner and John Sullivan for providing great leadership on these two pieces of legislation. I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Rush, for his opening statement.
Chairman, and I want to thank you for holding this hearing. Today we are marking up the so-called Jobs and Energy Permitting Act of 2011, which will amend Section 328 of the Clean Air Act that addresses air pollution from outer continental shelf drilling activities, and the Train Act, which would establish an interagency panel to analyze certain aspects of EPA regulations. The Train Act would highlight the costs of implementing the EPA rules, but does not take into account all the benefits of these regulations, including enhanced public health, increased job productivity, or lives saved. This bill will also not take into account the positive impacts that EPA regulations have had on our economy, including spurring additional research and development of clean energy technologies, instituting higher fuel efficiency standards, and helping make the country less dependent on foreign oil. Unfortunately, for many of my colleagues, if the benefits of a regulation cannot be monetized, such as lives saved or jobs lost prevented, then they are written off as having no economic value. I would submit that for many local communities, especially those less affluent ones, which are so often disproportionately affected by dirty air and the consequences that come with it, the omission of health impacts in the analysis that the Train Act calls for will be a great disservice to them. Additionally, my concerns with the Job and Energy Permitting Act of 2011 has been expressed through each step of this legislative process. The minority and the majority staffs have met to try to come up with a bipartisan bill that many on this side of the aisle could support, but without success to no avail. As I have stated in both hearings on this bill, putting the environmental impacts aside momentarily, one of my biggest concerns is that this bill will attempt to reduce the input of local communities, those very communities who in many cases are the ones most affected by the drilling proposed in these areas. And as a representative of the people, I find it odd that we would vote to take away the American people's right to participate in the local permitting process under the charade that we're doing this in their best interest. The amendments that I will offer today will attempt to address these problems so that we're not cutting out the people who are the most vulnerable and who have the most to lose when these permitting and regulatory decisions are made. Mr. Chairman, I hope that my colleagues on your side of the aisle, on the other side of the aisle, will be open to strengthening these bills so they're not being jammed through the committee and eventually the House floor, only to ultimately die in the Senate for a lack of bipartisan support. We have an opportunity, we have time, let's get it done the right way, and this is the right time. Let's get it done in a bipartisan manner today. I look forward to this markup, and with that I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. At this time, I recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton of Michigan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This markup addresses two significant and bipartisan bills in our American Energy Initiative, the Jobs and Energy Permitting Act and the Train Act. Americans are facing major economic threats. Some factors are outside our control, but others are completely self-imposed. Two of these threats are the continued rise of gasoline prices and the administration's regulatory assault on manufacturing and energy production. With these bills, this committee is answering the call of American households and businesses that are tired of watching the federal government get in the way of economic recovery. The Bipartisan Jobs and Energy Permitting Act, led by Mr. Gardner and Mr. Green, will provide the regulatory certainty for offshore oil exploration that is utterly lacking today. In the case of Shell Oil's efforts to produce oil off the coast of Alaska, permits have yet to be approved, after languishing for some 5 years at the EPA. Gasoline costs over $1 per gallon more today than it did 1 year ago, yet the administration continues to stand in the way of domestic energy production. This bill will end the never-ending circuit of permits, reviews, and appeals created by the EPA's current system for offshore drilling permit approval. Production off the coast of Alaska could make enormous strides to increase supply and bring down prices, decrease our foreign oil imports, refill the declining Trans-Alaska pipeline, and create literally tens of thousands of jobs. Yet the EPA insists on holding up the development of this resource that holds such great potential for our economy and national security. The Jobs and Energy Permitting Act will streamline EPA's process and force it to make decisions on permits in a timely manner. This is common sense legislation that should be approved by the panel and eventually the whole House. The Bipartisan Train Act, introduced by our colleagues Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Matheson, ensures that the federal government takes into account the cumulative impacts of proposed regulations for our economy. It seems obvious that the federal government would consider the consequences of its rules before imposing them, but anyone who has followed the actions of the EPA over the last 2 years has seen what has happened when such a law is not on the books. With the Train Act, we are not shutting down operations at EPA. We are not nullifying any of their regulations. We are simply asking for a more holistic study of the economic impacts of EPA regs. Without thoughtful consideration and deliberate application, certain regulations have the ability to shut down businesses, destroy jobs, and increase the price and availability of energy. I am very pleased that these two bills before the subcommittee today carry bipartisan sponsors. I announced at the beginning of the Congress that bipartisan bills and amendments would be the first to be recognized in the committee, and each of the bills we've moved so far in this subcommittee fulfills that charge. I thank our colleagues for their hard work and commitment to helping ease regulatory burdens and bring down the cost of energy, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Upton. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from California for purposes of an opening statement, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, the subcommittee considers two pieces of legislation, H.R. 1705, which requires additional studies of EPA regulations, and a discussion draft which addresses oil and gas drilling on the Outer Continental Shelf. I have serious concerns about both bills. H.R. 1705, known as the Train Act, creates a new government panel charged with evaluating the cumulative impacts of EPA and related state and local regulations. I support the effort to have good information about the potential impacts of regulation, but I can't support proposals that are one-sided, that will waste taxpayers' dollars with redundant or infeasible analyses, or that are designed to prevent EPA from doing its job of protecting public health and the environment. One serious problem is that this bill calls for an analysis of only the costs of regulation, not their benefits. It asks for an analysis of the impacts of regulations on the global economic competitiveness of the United States, but not on the benefits of reducing global climate change. It requires an assessment of the impacts of EPA's regulations on electricity and fuel prices, not on the health benefits of fewer cases of childhood asthma and longer lives. It calls for analysis of the impact of facility closures, but not of the facility openings that will be created by investment in clean energy. Unless we amend the bill to restore balance, it won't provide a fair and objective assessment of the rules to be examined. Another problem is the cost to taxpayers. Under current law, proposed regulations are already subject to extensive analysis prior to being finalized. The legislation may be too ambitious given the time available and the inherent limitations of economic modeling to produce any meaningful additional value. In its current form, the bill asks a new government committee to analyze actions that may or may not be taken by federal, state, and local regulators, including 100 state and local permitting agencies over the next 20 years. The committee is supposed to do this by next August, using state-of-the-art economic modeling and without the authority to collect information. There is no question that this effort will cost taxpayers dearly, but there is a real question of whether it is even remotely feasible. Today, we're also marking up a bill to amend the Clean Air Act to expedite air permits for oil and gas operations on the Outer Continental Shelf. I will also oppose this bill. It would do great damage to air quality in California and other coastal states. I believe the OCS air permitting process could be improved, so I reached out to the majority to see if they would work with us on the legislation. While we did have some staff discussions on the bill, Chairman Whitfield rejected my proposals and decided to pursue extreme changes to the law. The result is a bill that will produce more pollution, more litigation, and less public participation. Yesterday we had a hearing on a bill that oil companies are pushing to short-circuit the permit process for tar sands pipeline through America's heartland. Today we're marking up a bill to allow oil companies to pollute more, and on Thursday we'll mark up chemical security legislation that will fail to close critical security loopholes because the oil companies oppose such improvements. This agenda may be great for the oil companies, but it's wrong. It's a wrong agenda for this country. It puts the oil companies first and leaves the rest of us paying at the pump and in the quality of our environment. We hear that we need to pass these bills to reduce gas prices, but that's nonsense. Even if Shell's permits were issued today, it would be well over a decade before the wells would start producing. We heard testimony yesterday that the tar sands pipeline will actually raise gas prices, and leaving refineries vulnerable to terrorist attacks certainly won't lower gas prices. America has real energy problems, but these bills are not the solution. Waiving environmental requirements and short-circuiting permitting reviews may boost oil company profits, but it won't lower prices or enhance our energy security. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for this opportunity to give an opening statement, and I want to give back to you 21 seconds.
I really appreciate that. Thank you, sir. This is a markup, and members do have an opportunity to make 2-minute opening statements. So at this time, I recognize Mr. Sullivan for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield, and thank you for holding the subcommittee markup today. One important bill we are considering today is H.R. 1705, the Transparency and Regulatory Analysis of Impacts on the Nation Act of 2011, which I introduced earlier this month with my good friend and colleague Jim Matheson to address the cumulative cost of 14 economically significant EPA regulations and actions. Many of EPA's pending regulations and actions will cost our nation billions, impacting everything from energy reliability, jobs, manufacturing, and global economic competitiveness of the United States. The TRAIN Act will conduct an in-depth economic analysis so Congress and the American people can fully understand how the EPA's regulatory train wreck will impact our economy. In fact, 8 of EPA's proposed regulations cost a minimum of $1 billion on the U.S. economy. The time to address the full economic burden of these regulations is now. Specifically, the TRAIN Act would require a federal interagency analysis of the cumulative impact of certain rules and actions of the Environmental Protection Agency on global economic competitiveness, energy and fuel prices, and the reliability of U.S. bulk power supply. It would also look at the impacts of these regulations on state and local government jobs. Under this legislation, the Interagency Committee, not just EPA, will analyze the cumulative impact of 14 economically significant rules and actions issued by the EPA. This analysis will help Congress and federal agencies develop a better understanding on how these regulatory policies are impacting America's economy as a whole. What will all of this regulation cost? EPA doesn't know, and it has failed to conduct a study of overall cumulative cost of many of their regulations together, which is why this legislation is so important. We desperately need an honest accounting of EPA's regulations, which this bipartisan legislation will accomplish. I encourage my colleagues from both sides of the aisle to support this common-sense measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
This time we'll recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Today we meet to mark up 2 bills. The first is called the TRAIN Act, and the second is a draft of a bill that gives oil companies a free pass to pollute the air. Both bills are based on the premise that it is simply not possible to keep our air and water clean and still keep our economic engine chugging along. As we discuss these bills, I can't help but be reminded of the renowned children's story known as The Little Engine That Could. But in this version of the story, Republicans want to cast EPA as the little engine that can't. I think I can, the EPA says as it tries to defend our nation's rivers and lakes from becoming waste dumps. I think I can, the EPA says as it tries to remove cancer-causing materials from smokestacks and oil rigs. But EPA needs help, so EPA asks for cleaner air. No, the Shell Oil Company says. Can't you see I'm too busy drilling to take out the particulate matter and hydrocarbons? EPA asked for help making water safe to drink. No, says the coal industry. Can't you see I'm too weary from chopping mountaintops to worry about my arsenic-laced sludge? EPA asked for help ridding the air of cancer-causing chemicals. No, says the chemical manufacturers. I have a busy day making plastics and pesticides, and I don't have time to worry about that. But EPA wouldn't give up. And the utility companies, oil industry, and chemical plants were not happy. No, not one bit. So they made a train act that says, I guess we can't protect our children. I guess we can't keep our water clean. I guess we can't keep the air clean. These bills aren't trains that Americans should ride. They are train wrecks for our public health. Ending protections for clean air and clean water should be a third rail issue. But the Republican Tea Party Express that runs the Congress has veered off onto the far right track. Sadly, these are just the kind of anti-innovation, anti-science, anti-public health schemes the public has come to fear from this legislative wrecking crew. I yield back.
Thank you very much for reminding us of the little engine that could. We appreciate that. This time I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 2 minutes opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sounds like a grim fairy tale there. I think we can create jobs. I think we can create great wages with good benefits. I think and I know we can lower energy prices to help manufacturing and a thriving economy. If you want a growing economy with new high-paying jobs, we have to return to the fossil fuel industry. The hearing record is clear. EPA does not comply with the President's executive order individually, and they definitely do not do it collectively. Thanks to the Train Act, we're going to address the train wreck that's coming for the fossil fuel sector. And again, in delaying the permitting, as the hearing record is also clear, by the EPA through its own internal processes delaying this clean air permit for 5 years has delayed the ability to explore and recover oil. And again, at the hearing, everyone, even the opponents of the legislation, they do want the Trans-Alaskan pipeline to remain open. And the only way you're going to keep that thing open is if you fill it with oil. And if we're not able to do that, that pipeline will close, and the environmentalists will win, and we will have skyrocketing gas prices. So both these pieces of legislation are critical. Thanks for bringing them forward, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Shimkus. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for his 2-minute opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have an opening statement. I'd like to put one in the record and just say I support both these bills. And I enjoyed working with Mr. Gardner on his bill, the second one on coming up. So.
Thank you very much. Mr. Burgess, you're recognized for 2 minutes for opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, it is time to get people back to work. The two bills before us today are so simple and straightforward and intuitively obvious to the most casual of observers. They don't require hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money. They don't give Washington more power over people's lives. They simply make Washington work better, and shouldn't that be everyone's goal? The past 2 years, we've seen failure heaped upon failure by this administration and the previous Congress passing big government spending bills, and not only did they not put people back to work, but they hindered the economy from righting itself. Now, the Transparency and Regulatory Analysis, 1705, does what we have yet to get the Environmental Protection to do itself since it began its overreach and overregulation. This bill will look at the regulations coming out of the agency, aggregate them, and have independent oversight to review their cumulative impact, both positive and negative, that these rules can have on the economy and jobs. And how could you be opposed to that? The Jobs and Energy Permitting Act will streamline the process by which the Environmental Protection Agency will determine the air permits in the Arctic region, and it's also a simple and straightforward bill. We heard from witnesses as well as members on both sides of the dais that the 5 years that Shell has waited for a final agency determination on their exploratory permit is out of sync with the intent of the laws governing those permits. The EPA's own Environmental Advisory Board is in fact out of control and not serving the public interest. We do need accountability at the EPA, and this bill is just simply a step forward toward that result. Now, this is the type of jobs legislation that the public sent us here to pass. Let's help and get America back to work. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. This time recognize Mr. Walden for a 2-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate not only the hearings we've had on this legislation, but also our opportunity to actually mark it up and move America forward and put Americans back to work. Look, I don't care wherever you go in this country, my district, anybody else's district, people are hurting. Gas prices are going up. Energy costs are going up. We're seeing it on the West Coast, the East Coast. You see it everywhere. That's hurting families. We're losing jobs in America. We're shoving them offshore. Meanwhile, we have a president that goes down to Brazil and says, can't wait till you drill and pump and we'll be the first to buy it. Really? That is not a forward-looking policy for our country. We need to cut back on these overzealous regulations that are driving jobs offshore and out of our reach. And people are sick and tired of it. Wherever I go in my district, small businesses, medium-sized businesses say, just stop. Let us catch our breath. Let us get back on our feet. These rules and regulations, and we've got charts that we can show you that, just tell you that it's not just one agency, it's multiple agencies you deal with when you're in business. I mean, these things get argued about as if they were the only thing that you deal with. Dealing with incredible volumes of new rules and regulations coming out, one on top of another on top of another. All these threats to progress in America, while we're losing to foreign nations who are aggressively trying to grow their economies, grow their independence on energy, and profit by our overzealous regulators. Look, it's one thing we know about regulators, they're paid to write regulations, and they do a heck of a job of it day and night. And I'll tell you what, they don't have to pay the price that's paid by those who are out trying to figure out how to implement those rules in their businesses. And what they end up doing is cutting costs. You steal away the entrepreneurial spirit that allowed America to be a great country. We got to turn that around. This legislation and more to come does that, and I urge its approval.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Bill Ray, for 2 minutes.
Yep. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you bringing this bill up. And let me just say this as a Californian. And I guess this is one way to be able to have people on both sides of the aisle be able to agree about and have some perspective. It seems like the message as a Californian I should bring is we're doing to America what Californians have been doing to themselves for the last few decades. That meaning well to take environmental regs and apply them in isolated situations without looking at the holistic impact is not only stupid, but it's immoral. And Californians have been doing this to the point where when our scientists make major breakthroughs or develop great economic and environmental opportunities, they can't provide the jobs and the opportunity within California. They have to leave the state. And I'll give you 2 instances. One is the environmental scientists over at Scripps Institute of Oceanography have developed genetically altered algae that can produce true gasoline, true oil, and true jetco. And the Californians invested in this. California taxpayers actually helped subsidize the UC system that did the research, but when it comes time to go into production, those scientists had to leave California, pack up and get out of the state, because it would take more than 10 years to get the permits through the environmental regulations of California when it was only 9 months in New Mexico, so they cited there. When you had scientists and business people figure out how to make a car that gets 200 miles to the gallon, when it came time for them to go to the Energy Department, the Federal Energy Department said, we will support you, but only if you don't try to produce it in California, because it's not practical to produce jobs in California. I bring this up because we're doing the same thing nationally that has been done in the past in California, and I hope that we can avoid that problem in the other states. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bilbright. This time I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since Republicans have been leading the House for the last few months, we've passed legislation that brings a common sense approach to establishing an all-of-the-above energy strategy that will strengthen our country's energy security, create good jobs here at home, reduce our dependence on Middle Eastern oil, and lower gas prices at the pump. For too long, this administration has led an all-out assault on domestic energy production and has insisted on shipping millions of American jobs overseas, oftentimes to countries who don't like us. From radical EPA rules that will raise electricity costs on every American to regulations on manufacturing that will result in higher prices on goods to consumers, this administration must reverse these job-killing policies. In my home state of Louisiana and all along the Gulf Coast, where approximately 1/3 of our domestic oil and almost 1/4 of our domestic natural gas is produced, this administration has insisted on blocking safe drilling off our coast. By refusing to issue permits and stalling the entire permitting process, this administration is dangerously jeopardizing America's energy security, and these failed policies have already resulted in over 13,000 jobs lost. That's why, and that's using the White House numbers, by the way. Americans spoke loud and clear last fall that they want to end these radical liberal policies being pursued by this administration and replace them with common sense solutions that will put Americans back to work, get our economy back on track, and eliminate wasteful Washington spending. The bills before our subcommittee today are steps in the right direction toward these goals and will actually strengthen America's energy security and shine the light on the failed policies of this administration. And just look at the results. You know, we've talked about the president's failed policies and what they've done to gas prices. I call it the Obama premium, the fact that gas prices have more than doubled at the pump since the president's been in office and shut down so much area of known reserves in America. And then, by the way, if you're not sure what I'm saying, just look at the president's own words. Just look at his administration. The president talked about having a gradual adjustment to near $4 a gallon of gasoline in 2008. Unfortunately, he's gotten his wish, and a lot sooner. His own energy secretary, he wants to boost gas prices to the levels that they are in Europe. We don't want the gas prices in Europe. We don't want to boost our gas to $4 a gallon. We can be energy secure and create good jobs here at home and lower gas prices at the pump, and that's what these bills do. I yield back.
Recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. McMorris Rogers, for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have an excellent opportunity to advance two of this new majority's priorities, economic growth and reducing our dependence on foreign oil. We're marking up two bills today that will help rein in the train wreck of regulations that are stifling economic growth and prosperity and clarify existing law so that responsible domestic oil exploration can proceed. The federal government should not and must not continue to stand in the way of American energy and American jobs. One guy in my district put it this way. He says, there's a big elephant in the middle of the road, Kathy, and it's the federal government, and it's getting harder and harder to get around it. Both of these bills before us today can help advance our basic principle. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for scheduling this markup today. I support both of these bills. Earlier this year, President Obama promised a thorough review of federal regulations to eliminate burdensome regulations that stifle job creation and make our economy less competitive. I believe the TRAIN Act will help the President in achieving his stated goal of identifying federal regulations that are costing American jobs and taking a toll on our economy. It's important for the American people to have an opportunity to understand the cumulative effects of EPA regulations on energy reliability, affordability, and security. The TRAIN Act is the first step in determining just how big of an impact these regulations are having on our economy. Similarly, federal agencies, especially the EPA, should tell the American people the number of jobs lost or gained from any proposed rule. I've introduced legislation that would do just that, and would also require the EPA to provide the public with their analysis used to make that determination. In addition to the TRAIN Act, the Jobs and Energy Permitting Act before us will help clarify and improve the EPA's decision-making in air permitting off the coast of Alaska and restore much-needed certainty to that regulatory process. As we've heard in testimony before this committee, Shell Oil has already invested over $3 billion in developing U.S. energy sources in the Outer Continental Shelf of Alaska. It's unconscionable that the necessary air permits to begin operations has taken 5 years with no end in sight. Let's get the federal government out of the way and create American jobs by developing American sources of energy. With these two bills, we will make this administration accountable for its regulatory actions and provide the certainty needed by the private sector to grow jobs and get our economy back on track. I thank the chairman and look forward to moving these two bills forward through the full committee and the House floor.
Thank you very much. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for opening statement.
Chairman, the TRAIN Act is the latest in a series of common sense approaches that will seek to put the focus on economic development instead of environmental overreach and away from overeager federal bureaucrats who are more interested in creating regulatory policy instead of jobs. Oh, they say they're concerned about jobs, but their actions say otherwise. We have seen this particular case of overregulation and job destruction strike home in West Virginia with a retroactive veto of a mining permit in Logan County that cost us hundreds of jobs and millions of dollars in investment without any new sound science or documentation. One of the proposed regulations, which HB 1705 would conduct analysis, is the EPA's proposed coal ash regulation. Nearly 42% of fly ash is recycled, providing American businesses with the ability to recycle these products into various projects. This act would prevent also the utility companies that would be discouraged from using coal as a means of creating electricity. Courageously standing up to the EPA, other agencies throughout the interagency comment period have concluded that fly ash is not hazardous. More openness and greater transparency were supposed to be the hallmark. What we're seeing, though, is that we're seeing uncertainty swirling in the marketplace. Let's be sensible about what we're doing here. Congress should not allow unelected bureaucrats to decide to close a mine or shut down a rig without filing a comprehensive economic analysis. Hiding behind shameful scare tactics is pathetic. And by those on the other side of this debate, it's unconscionable. Yield back my time.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Colorado for a 2-minute opening statement. Mr. Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup today on job creation and energy security, both the TRAIN Act and the Jobs and Energy Permitting Act of 2011. Mr. Chairman, oil production in Alaska could reach up to 1 million barrels of oil per day, which would reduce our dependency on foreign oil by nearly 10% under this act. So to think that the administration's policy toward Alaska has been so detrimental to development and production is simply baffling to me, which is why the Jobs and Energy Permitting Act is so vital. The bill allows the EPA to do what it was meant to do without the bureaucratic red tape and the needless circles of appeals and litigation. It makes simple clarifications and some key changes that will responsibly and safely increase production in a resource-rich area like the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas, where exploration has yet to even begin on leases that were signed over 5 years ago. Mr. Chairman, we are all reeling from staggering prices at the pump, both Republican and Democrat alike. In fact, according to an analysis from Cameron Hanover, for every penny the price of gasoline rises, it costs consumers millions of dollars a day. That's billions of dollars over an entire year. A small increase costing our economy, jobs, and family income. Many estimates suggest that developing the Outer Continental Shelf has the potential to create over 50,000 jobs annually and well over $100 billion in payroll. Jobs not only in Alaska, but beyond as well. Increased oil and gas production in Alaska will result in jobs across the United States. And moreover, allowing companies to develop resources in Alaska will help the pain at the pump that all our constituents are feeling. Mr. Chairman, thanks to the hard work of my colleague from Texas, Mr. Green, this final bill will be a product of numerous hearings, taking into account both praise and criticism of the draft bill we initially presented weeks ago, a bipartisan product that we can all be proud of. It continues to protect state law, and states like California, which have delegated authority, continues to provide public participation. And Administrator Lisa Jackson of the EPA has already said that there are no human health risks associated with this drilling. This bill is a compilation of hard work, and I hope we can move it forward. Jobs and gas prices depend on it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, for a 2-minute opening.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to talk about an example. Sometimes we talk about these regulations in the air, and I want to give a real example. But first, I want to thank Mr. Sullivan of Oklahoma and Mr. Mathis from Utah for introducing H.R. 1705. You know, in Kansas, we've been trying to build a power plant. It's called Holcomb 2 for years now. It is one of the most technologically advanced units in the state of Kansas, with emissions that will be only a fraction of the average coal plant in the state. What's tragic about Holcomb is that despite this innovation we are seeing in building a cleaner burning plant, EPA's new utility MAC rule will make it impossible for this project to get off the ground. The emission standards for mercury and non-mercury metals alone will be at such low levels that I'm very concerned that are not even technologically feasible. You know, good people can have disagreements about some EPA regulations, but our common goal should be cleaner air without unnecessarily compromising jobs and economic growth. The power plant Holcomb alone would create over 3,000 Kansas jobs. That's why 1705 is so critical. It requires common sense examination of so many of EPA's disastrous regulations, including the utility MAC, coal ash, and the greenhouse gas new source performance standards for petroleum refineries and utilities. Look, ideally, I'd like to see all of EPA's train wreck rules rescinded and have them go back to the drawing board to create workable, health-based solutions. I doubt I'd have many friends on the other side of the aisle support me on this. But I can't understand how anyone could be opposed to a temporary interagency committee that solely looks at the economic impact of a very specific set of EPA regulations. I think the Train Act is a very good first step. Frankly, I'd like to see this legislation go further and require cumulative analysis of all EPA regulations going forward. So I find it hard to believe that anyone could oppose this common sense bill. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Griffith of I'm sorry. Mr. Griffith, 1 minute. Recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for the purposes of the opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for extending me the courtesy, even though I'm a little bit late. I appreciate today's markup on these two bills, H.R. 1705, the Transparency and Regulatory Analysis of Impacts in the Nation Act of 2011, and the discussion draft about Jobs and Energy Permitting Act of 2011. The Environmental Protection Agency has not conducted the required and expected impact analysis of the multiple roles they plan to impose within the new source performance standards. The impact analysis is of vital importance because of the broad spectrum of industries that these regulations will affect. We're talking about not only utility companies, but also agriculture, waste management, residential and commercial facilities. It's estimated that the EPA proposal will severely restrict economic development and industrial growth nationwide. EPA's own estimates of the annual compliance cost of the industries is somewhere between $19 million to $90 million per year by the year 2020, just for the proposed ozone standard. For all of the other standards under the new source performance standards, the estimated cost to the industries and consumers are hundreds of billions of dollars. On the loss of over 1 million jobs. In a bad economy, why would the EPA, or for that matter, any regulatory agency, propose such outrageous regulatory standards without any regard to how these regulations will actually affect the nation? They have provided absolutely no proof that the standards they wish to impose will provide any measurable value or health benefits that outweigh the cost to consumers and our overall economy. Let's talk about the facts. The EPA is attempting to put a chokehold on our own industry and job development by imposing standards that produce cause and effect that the world can see, that produce a cause and effect the world can see. In the electric generating unit, EGU, maximum available control technology, also known as the utility MACT, the EPA has created several errors. In preparation for its rulemaking, the EPA issued an information collection request of unprecedented size and scope for a Section 112 rulemaking. The Utility Air Regulatory Group has found widespread errors in the way the EPA used to convert historical emissions data to common emissions units. This is important. Specifically, the conversion factor that the EPA used to convert measurements reported in terms of pounds per gigawatt to pounds per megawatt, it's incorrect by a factor of 1,000. I want to repeat, it's incorrect by a factor of 1,000, order of magnitude 1,000, Mr. Chairman. Now, we all know the phrase close enough for government work, but an order of magnitude error of 1,000? Give me a break. As a result, the emissions of the unit chosen as the single best performing mercury source are actually 1,000 times higher than those that the EPA assumed in setting the new MACT standard for mercury. This conversion error also pervades EPA's mercury MACT floor analysis for existing units. There is also concern that significant errors were made in the risk calculations reported by the EPA in an attempt to support appropriate and necessary findings. Modeling assumptions have just been provided within the last 2 weeks to the appropriate agencies, so specific errors have yet to be identified. I could go on, Mr. Chairman, but I think I'm making my point. EPA does not really care about doing an effective, in my opinion, an effective cost-benefit analysis. It does not really care about the nuts and bolts, the technical requirements to set these standards correctly. As a result, who knows? So that's why your bill, or this committee's bill, Mr. Chairman, is so important. I am in complete agreement that it's absolutely a necessity to establish an interagency committee to analyze the impacts of the proposed regulations might have on our country. H.R. 1705 addresses these issues and allows us the opportunity to analyze these decisions before we bankrupt the country. With regards to the Outer Continental Shelf, it is so crucial to our nation's energy security that we should keep the Alaska pipeline full for our friends in California and the rest of the country. Without this pipeline, California, Washington State, and Alaska will suffer untold economic harm. The red tape between the EPA and the Environmental Appeals Board in getting permits for leases obtained 5 years before shows that both agencies have been economically irresponsible to the industries that have invested in the future of this country. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing it to the country's attention, and hopefully we can move this bill to prevent similar problems in the future. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Before I recognize Mr. Griffith of Virginia, I would just want to make an announcement that the Prime Minister of Israel is addressing a joint session of Congress at 11 a.m. We're going to recess for that, and then 10 minutes after that, we're going to come back. We're going to debate the amendments, and at 1 o'clock, we're going to roll all the amendments till 1, and we're going to vote at 1 o'clock, basically, on the amendments on this first bill. Mr. Griffith, you're recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Coming from the state legislature, I learned early on it's the obligation of legislators to accumulate information and have all the data present so that they can make decisions. Regrettably, I find in Congress that not only do we not want to accumulate the information, but for some reason we believe that the agencies of the administrative branch that were originally created by Congress should have more power than Congress itself. I, for one, do not believe that. I believe that Congress is where the decisions should be made. And I think that without passing this bill and other bills like this, we are not doing our obligation to the voters. Whether you're Democrat or Republican, we have an obligation to acquire this information. In my recent campaign, one of my supporters, Jim Ferrara of Abingdon, Virginia, came up with a slogan that started showing up on pins and bumper stickers that said, "Who elected the EPA?" Well, nobody elected the EPA, and our citizens, again, whether Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, expect the United States Congress to make the decisions and not some unelected bureaucrat. And last but not least, Mr. Chairman, I would point out that if we are talking about the little engine that could, we should remember its historical context. The little engine that could was a steam engine. The story first appeared in 1905. which means that today one can assume it used coal or wood to power it. And one would have to assume today that under the current regulatory scheme, when the little engine found out it couldn't make it up the hill and nobody else was willing to help it get up that hill, it would have to go to the EPA and ask for permission to use more energy because it was going to create a larger carbon footprint in order to get over that hill. So I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, we need to support this bill so the little engine that could continue to bring jobs to the American public. Thank you.
Mr. Griffith, thank you again for bringing up the little engine. And this time we're going to recess for the Prime Minister of Israel's remarks, and then we're going to reconvene 10 minutes after that. We'll debate the amendments and then roll them until 1 o'clock. We're in recess. The chair calls the markup back to order. When we took a recess, I had indicated that we were going to debate these amendments and then we would roll them until about 1 o'clock for a vote at 1 o'clock on the amendments. Subsequent to that announcement, we now realize that many of our friends are having a private meeting with the Prime Minister of Israel between 1 and 1:30. So we're going on and start discussion of the amendments, and then we're going to roll the votes until probably 1:30. And at that time, we do expect that most of the members will be back and be able to vote on those amendments. Did you want to make a comment, Mr. Rush?
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to say that I really want to allow members who are not present now, who will be here, who are expected to be here at 1:30 or later. Hopefully that meeting with President Netanyahu, that it ends on time. But in my only concern is that members who show up subsequent to us hearing the bill, the amendments to any of these bills, any of the two bills, and the debate that would take place at this point in time, that any member that shows up subsequent to us apply to committee legislation. Every new program authorization must be accompanied by an equivalent cut in other authorized programs in the committee's jurisdiction. But now, on the first bill that poses a challenge, the majority is attempting to evade its own requirement by dropping the authorization language. Mr. Chairman, this is evidence of what an empty promise cut goal was in the first place. And I yield that back to the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speak in support of the amendment. I would just say that as we found out in the last one of the hearings that there are 17,000 employees of the EPA, similar numbers throughout the other agencies that would have to do that. Surely they could find folks to do this. And I kind of reject the premise that they should be able to find the people and the funds to be able to do this within the existing budgetary authorization. I yield back.
Thank you. Is there anyone else on this side of the aisle like to speak? I would just make one comment also. I think Mr. Rush is correct. There are 11 departments and our agencies involved in this legislation. All of them have budgets and sources of funds through the appropriation process, and we do genuinely believe that they would be able to fulfill the responsibilities and obligation of this legislation without the specific authorization of another $2 million. So I think that's the purpose of Mr. Sullivan's amendment.
Would you yield, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I just want us to, this morning's hearing, opening statements, we focused on fairy tales. Now we are here at allegories. And let me just say that, allegorically, Mr. Chairman, that we're opening up Pandora's box. I want us to recognize that Pandora's box is now officially open in this committee, because now we are making it, we're eliminating our own cut-and-go provisions and standards, and now we're making it an argument that whatever department have a number of employees, then cut-and-go will not apply to that department. I yield back. I'll give it back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate you bringing up the Pandora box issue as well. Is there any other further discussion on this particular amendment? If not, then according to the stated policy in the beginning, we will delay the vote on this amendment until 1:30, unless you all want to do a voice vote.
No, Mr. Chairman, I think we ought to, in respect for other members who are not present, who are meeting with President Netanyahu, we should continue to hold a vote and keep the record open for any other comments.
Oh, okay. Then we've finished with that amendment. Are there any further amendments to this legislation?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Will the clerk report the amendment?
It's Rush 34.
An amendment offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, almost every single bill introduced in this subcommittee under the banner of the so-called American Energy Initiative, which we just completed our 8th hearing on yesterday, my friends on the other side of the aisle have attempted to reduce the red tape and streamline the process to make it easier for oil companies to drill without delay, even if it meant sidestepping the input of states and local communities. A case in point is the second bill we're marking up today, which attempts to make it easier for Shell to acquire the permits they need to begin drilling in the outer continental shelf in Alaska in an expeditious manner by cutting out state and community input. Yet, in place of this legislation, the Train Act, we have the majority attempting to do just the opposite, add an extra layer of red tape and create yet another committee to study the impacts of proposed EPA regulations to delay implementation, even though by law the agency is already required to do so. Unfortunately, my friends on the other side of the aisle conveniently left off the health effects of the proposed regulations as one of the cumulative impacts that this bill would analyze. I understand that for some of my colleagues, if a regulation cannot be monetized, that it has no benefit. But for many communities that do not have the money and connections of the oil and gas industries, there is no more important benefit than protecting their health and their livelihoods. So the amendment that I am offering today will do precisely that. It will amend this bill to include important environmental protection and health agencies that were omitted from the original bill. My amendment would add the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, as well as the Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, among others, to the interagency council that this bill would create. Additionally, my amendment would direct the committee to look at the important health impacts that will be affected by EPA's proposed rules, including asthma rates, birth defects, premature mortality, and the effect of promoting clean energy jobs and technologies. If some of my colleagues were worried that existing studies that have already been conducted focus too heavily on health and environmental impacts of proposed EPA rules and did not sufficiently take into account the jobs and the economic analysis, then let's not make the same mistakes on this bill. Let's make sure the committee established under this bill takes a balanced and unbiased approach if the majority feels that previous studies were indeed slanted. By including health and environmental impacts of proposed EPA rules, we can ensure that this bill enjoys the support of a much larger coalition as it moves its way through the legislative process. So I urge all of my colleagues to support this amendment, and with that I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The Chair will recognize Mr. Griffith for comments on this amendment for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, my concern with this amendment and others like it in language in this regard is that these amendments always want to look at the resulting reduction in asthma by virtue of the new regulation. They want to look at the reduction in various types of birth defects, etc. But it never talks about the other side of the health equation, which is that when you make the cost of heating your home more expensive, then people have to start choosing, particularly in the areas that are not as affluent, they have to choose between heating their homes and whether or not they put food on the table. So if we were going to have a real discussion about the health impacts of a particular regulation, I think it shouldn't just talk about how the regulation helps, but it should also be looking into how the regulation hurts. Because if we make the cost of fuel go up, whether it be electricity rates or the cost of gasoline or the cost of fuel oil for people's homes, that has a direct impact on their health. And unfortunately, the language in the amendment proposed does not address that at all. It only looks at the positive side. It doesn't look at the negative side, because a lot of these regulations in a real-world experience cause problems. We've seen significant increases in the cost of electricity in my district, and as a result of that, I know that there are families out there, and in fact, the Democrat minority leader in the Virginia House of Delegates just last year was railing on the floor about how constituents who live in the 9th District of Virginia and overlap in his district are not able to heat their homes because of the rising electric rates. So I would submit, Mr. Chairman, that we should vote against this amendment, that it doesn't, it only looks at one side of that issue. If we wanted to look at all health impacts, including the rising cost of energy, et cetera, or the cost of these regulations as it relates to the consumer and the health effects on those consumers, particularly those who are less economically advantaged, then perhaps the amendment might have some merit, but as it is written, it has no merit. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Griffith. anyone, Ms. Capps, you're recognized for the purpose of speaking on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to offer my support to the Rush Amendment. Mr. Chairman, this amendment brings balance to the Train Act. I believe without such balance, the analysis wouldn't be credible or useful. Even with the adoption of this amendment, I would remain concerned that the required analysis may simply not be possible to conduct. But if the balance provided by this amendment is essential, if not sufficient, but the balance provided by this amendment is essential, if not sufficient, to ensuring a high-quality and credible product. At the hearing on this bill, several witnesses expressed concern that the analysis required by this bill would focus only on costs, not on benefits. I appreciate that the sponsors made changes to respond in part to those concerns, but in several ways, the analysis remains unbalanced. As currently drafted, important economic impacts like reduction in the number of work and school days missed, or reduction in the occurrence of adverse health effects, and savings due to decreased use of emergency medical services wouldn't be specifically included. The analysis would consider impacts on small businesses and agriculture, but not vulnerable subpopulations and developing infants and children. The Rush Amendment would correct that imbalance. It would also ensure that the makeup of the committee is balanced by including departments and offices who have expertise in health, disease, and environmental quality. This kind of balance is essential to ensuring a high-quality and credible product. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment to bring balance to this committee and this analysis. And I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Capps. Is there anyone on our side of the aisle that would like to speak on the amendment? I would just make one comment. When EPA did analysis of the impact of these regulations, they spent a great deal of time and energy looking at health benefits from these regulations. And really, one of the reasons this legislation was introduced is that we did not feel there was a thorough enough analysis for the impact on the economy, on jobs, on global competitiveness, and we felt like that the health benefits had already been thoroughly analyzed by EPA before they issued the regulations. So that's the reason that we did not include it in the bill.
Mr. Chairman, would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield to the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, that's the reason I made my comments, because when we had hearing earlier, one of the things that was said, I raised that issue about the costs and what happened when they were looking at some regulations, what happened when you raised those costs on heating, and the administrator basically came back with, and I paraphrase, something to the effect of, well, there are programs to help people, we don't want to freeze anybody. But it appeared to me from that statement that there was not, even in the EPA's analysis of the health, while it covered all the things this amendment covered, they did not actually look at what the ramifications would be when the cost to heat your home went up, and that was the reason I made my comments earlier.
Well, I mean, I agree with you, and there are so many regulations coming out. I honestly do believe it would be, we would be missing our responsibility if we did not do a complete analysis of the cumulative impact of all these regulations. So with that,
yeah, for me, just for a moment.
I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, I think you used the word thorough in your remarks, and I think that's the operative word. We want to make this bill as thorough and as comprehensive as we possibly can, and I think it's. I certainly agree with the gentleman from Virginia. I think that we have more in common than we have that we might disagree on, because obviously he represents a district where there are economically challenged individuals, and so do I. So I'm not, and we have problems in terms of the rising cost of heating in my district too. But these matters are what I understand is that the underlying bill addresses these particular matters, and I'm just asking for some additional concern and additional input from those who are responsible for the overall health, be it from an economic perspective or some other kind of perspective, just the overall health consideration of all the individuals. And so I think that the gentleman and I are in agreement. I just wanted the bill to be more thorough and to specifically address the issues of health-related matters.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. And reclaiming my time, I think that concludes all discussion on this particular amendment, and so we will also roll the vote on this until 1:30. Are there any further amendments to this particular legislation? The gentlelady from California is recognized to explain her amendment.
Yes, I have an amendment.
Would the clerk please report the amendment?
Amendment number 1?
Yes, please.
An amendment offered by Ms. Capps of California.
The gentlelady is recognized for the purposes of explaining her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is my hope that we can simply all agree to this amendment. We do live in a world of limited resources, and my amendment seeks to ensure that those resources are used wisely. As currently drafted, H.R. 1705 would require a dizzying number of analysis of EPA rules. History shows us that it would take years to conduct studies like these. For instance, in 2003, Congress asked the National Academy of Sciences to examine the effects of just 2 EPA rules relating to stationary sources. That study took 3.5 years to complete. The Train Act is much more far-reaching than this. It calls explicitly for more than a dozen rules to be analyzed, as well as other rules and actions that may be proposed over the next 2 decades. And it doesn't stop there. Because the Clean Air Act allows state and local governments flexibility as to how they achieve healthy air, the legislation also requires analysis of potentially hundreds of state and local rules. It's not even limited to the currently proposed rules. And all of the analysis must be completed by next August. There's a real question about whether this is even remotely feasible. My amendment simply states that the committee created by H.R. 1705 should perform analysis to the extent they are feasible, given available information first, and second, the limitations of economic modeling, and third, available funding. It also allows the committee to complete the analysis to the extent the information produced is useful to policymakers and stakeholders. If the analyses are not feasible or not useful, we should not be spending taxpayer resources on them. I hope that's something we could agree upon. Let me give you an example. Section 3, parentheses B, parentheses 1, parentheses B, requires that the committee use a, and this is a quote, general equilibrium model approach, end quote. I have my doubts that this is a wise statutory requirement. The subcommittee has received no testimony on this particular analytic method, and it is not common to spell out specific economic modeling approaches in statute. Moreover, my understanding is that this approach is particularly ineffective at capturing and placing value on hard-to-monetize benefits like developmental problems in children attributable to exposure to pollution. Under my amendment, the committee would be able to bypass this requirement if it isn't feasible or useful to do it. My amendment also charges the committee to carry out the law in such a way that it doesn't delay or interfere with other statutory or legal obligation. This is a common sense amendment. It attempts to make a Herculean task more manageable given the time and the resource limitations before us. And that is why I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Capps. Is there anyone on our side of the aisle who would like to speak in opposition to her amendment?
I would, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just say what we're trying to do is get the national government to comply with the President's executive order, which he signed on January 18th that said we need to have a job impact and analysis of these regs. In constant testimony with the EPA, they haven't done it, and they won't do it. And the provision of this says, let's get the federal agencies to comply, and let's look at the multitude of regulations that come down, i.e. the train wreck, the boiler mac, mercury mac, cooling towers, transport rule, you name them, they're all coming down, especially on the fossil fuel electricity generation. And we're saying we ought to at least comply with what the president said. Let's do an economic analysis. The EPA is already doing their health analysis. That's why they're promulgating these rules. We're just asking, and really we would be dictating to these agencies, do what the president said, and let's get a job and economic analysis. Now, if you take all the agencies involved, 10 of them, surely they can put together a handful of folks to do this. We know the EPA has 17,000 employees. Multiply that by 5, and that's probably how many federal employees that are already on the payroll who can do this job. And that's all we're saying. Direct these folks to work together to move this so that we can have an understanding in this economy with the loss of jobs that the attack on the fossil fuel industry by this administration has to stop if we want low-cost power and we want more fossil fuel jobs.
Would the gentleman...
I'd be happy to yield.
Granted that that's a goal and a worthwhile goal, why not give this committee the jurisdiction or the task, let's put it this way, to take on a large organization, as you've already said, that has many mandates it has been given, and in a common sense approach say, what is the rational way we can do this? I mean, these efforts are going to require taxpayer dollars. Wouldn't it be wise to do it in an orderly fashion?
And I would reclaim our time. I would say that's what we're doing. I would say we're trying to get an interagency group of people who are already on the payroll to evaluate these regs and comply with what the president asked his government to do, which is give us a job and economic analysis. Now, they may say they may do it for one rule or reg, but again, the great thing about this piece of legislation, no one's doing a comprehensive analysis of the economic impact of 4 or 5 regulations coming down on one sector at one time. That's why this interagency aspect can be very, very helpful in helping the president reach his goals and objectives, which is, okay, we know there's important rules and regs out there. We ought to see what the job and economic impact of this is. This legislation helps do that, and I think it can do within the structure and the budget and the employees and the staffs of the agencies we have already. And with that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Are there any further?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized to speak in favor of the amendment.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, this is a common sense amendment. As a matter of fact, Mr. Chairman, I have not, in my interaction, and since she's been on this committee, I have not known the author of this amendment to introduce an amendment that wasn't common sense. So this certainly is consistent with her aforementioned practice. Mr. Chairman, the majority introduced a bill to expedite drilling in Alaska for shale. The majority introduced a bill to expedite the Keystone XL pipeline for Trans-Canada. However, this bill will create more bureaucracy and red tape to study jobs and economic impacts of EPA rules, which is already required by law. There's an executive order that exists already. The law is already there. And the CAPS amendment will simply ensure that rules that are already in the pipeline for years are not delayed or otherwise interfered with, so they can be implemented on time. The Regulatory Flexibility Act and Small Business Regulation Enforcement Fairness Act already require economic analysis for every rule, and that all the agencies comply with these rules. So I don't know why we would hear the argument, and I don't know why the majority would oppose this amendment, because I think it makes sense. we should not create more red tape. And I thought that that was the modus operandi, and that was the meaning, and that's what the purpose of what the other side was attempting to do, to eliminate red tape. But here you are creating more red tape.
Gentlemen, the chairman recognizes himself speaking opposition to the amendment. We had a lot of hearings about a lot of these regulations, and many times EPA testified that they did not conduct analysis of the impact of the regulations on jobs, and they certainly did not look at global competitiveness. But I think the thing that disturbs me most about the gentlelady from California's amendment is that it basically would gut our legislation because it provides almost clear autonomy by the committee on whether or not to conduct the analysis and prepare the report based on if they consider it feasible, based on if they feel like the economic modeling is limited, based on lack of funding, based on is it going to be useful to policymakers and stakeholders, and based on that the Act does not delay or otherwise interfere with the implementation of other obligations of those departments or agencies. So if we adopted this amendment, we may as well not have a bill at all. So I would speak very vehemently in opposition to the amendment, recognizing all the good intentions of the gentlelady who offered it. I'd be happy to yield.
Thank you. Since you have a little time, and that gives me a chance to respond. You know, this is really not arguing against the bill, this amendment. It is simply talking about what's feasible. What is it pragmatically or practically possible to do? And I am, you know, being that these are taxpayer dollars in some amount that we're going to be using, I would think it would be in their interest, and which we should be supporting, to make sure that this is something before, as it is embarked upon, that it's sort of a charting and outline of what's feasible to accomplish. But I also want to speak to, and it's a little bit about a previous amendment, our colleague from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, says that agencies, he's concerned that agencies are not looking at cumulative economic impacts. The same could be said at looking at cumulative health benefits either. But the majority just rejected an amendment to provide that kind of balance. So, you know, again, it's about balance, it's about what is feasible, and it's about being willing, if we're going to look at cumulative effects of economic impact, that we also look at cumulative effects of health and environmental benefits as well. And I'll yield to either someone else or yield back.
Well, it's my time. I think I'll take it back.
It's your time.
But I might say one of the things I like about this Sullivan legislation is that it specifically directs these departments and agencies to do what Congress wants. And frequently, and under your amendment, we would once again be allowing the agencies, the departments, to do what they want to do, to interpret it the way they want to interpret it, to determine is it feasible, is it useful. This legislation says, in our view, it is useful, the information is important, and we need to know the impact on the economy. So with that, I yield to the gentleman from
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think it's important that if the EPA has a discretion and regulators have the discretion to do what they think is important, we've had witnesses testify exactly what they believe is important, and that is to ignore the executive order of the President that requires the impact on jobs to be considered. The Assistant Administrator Stanislaus at that table said that they do not take into account jobs when they did an economic analysis.
Correct. Yield to the gentleman from Oklahoma.
And when they were asked that, too, they said that because they didn't have to, and we want them to have to do it. Also, I'd just like the gentlelady from California to know that cumulative benefits and costs are specified in the bill.
Well, I yield back the balance of my time. Are there any further amendments to this bill? Well, the committee has now concluded its consideration of amendments to the train bill. And when we are prepared to vote, we will consider the Sullivan Amendment, the Rush Amendment, the Capps Amendment, and final passage. Now, the chair at this point will call up H.R., and we don't have a number yet, the Jobs and Energy Permitting Act of 2011, and ask the clerk to report.
Discussion draft H.R. blank to amend the Clean Air Act regarding air pollution from outer continental shelf activities.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. In keeping with Chairman Upton's policy of giving priority to bipartisan amendments, I would like to, at this point, to recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, to offer a set of amendments en bloc, and without objection, the clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment en bloc offered by Mr. Gardner of Colorado.
And the gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes in support of this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my colleague from Texas, Mr. Green, and I have an amendment that has circulated through the committee and is enjoyed this bill has enjoyed not only regular order, but a robust and open process that has included 2 legislative hearings over a month of debate. The purpose of a discussion draft is to openly and transparently solicit input on a proposal so that we can make improvements as legislation moves forward. The purpose of our joint amendment is to incorporate the very valuable suggestions that we receive from both members and stakeholders. Most of the changes are technical in nature, but I think they are very valuable to the bill and make a stronger committee product. Others are substantive, and I think they are important changes to make. The first changes are in Section 2. Specifically, we state that air quality impacts can be measured or modeled as appropriate. This change is being made to accommodate situations when we do not have instrumentation for measurement, and we must simply model those impacts. Also in Section 2, a redundant reference to onshore location is deleted because the Clean Air Act already defines onshore within its terms corresponding onshore area. The next change is in Section 3, where we clarify that if the exploration vessel moves away and comes back to the drilling area for weather or for other reasons it leaves, the vessel is not to be treated as a stationary source when it's moving. I think that makes sense. EPA shouldn't regulate a vessel as stationary when it is moving. That said, without precise clarity, this kind of issue has held up billions of barrels of oil in Alaska that could lower the price of gasoline over time. In general, Section 4 addresses the permit process. It gives a deadline for action, giving energy companies certainty and energy markets predictability. Because again, 5 years is simply too long for an agency to sit on the fence. And with the American people imploring for relief at the pump, we need to simplify the procedure for obtaining these air permits, especially for exploration drilling, which is temporary in nature. Section 4 is being amended to limit its scope to exploration permits, where 6 months is not only reasonable, it is imperative if we are to increase our domestic energy production and ultimately lower gas prices at the pump. In addition, we make clear that the EPA can have a reconsideration of the permit within the 6-month time frame. For example, reconsideration by the administrator herself. However, reconsideration cannot include the Environmental Appeals Board, which has been the source of the endless do-loop ping-pong process in the Shell permit case. EAB increases litigation because the EAB is litigation and makes the path to certainty take longer than the nation can afford. It was always the intent of the discussion draft to remove EAB from the process. This amendment makes that intent much more clear. After EPA's 6-month deadline, the remedy for disagreement is once and for all to go to court. No reconsideration, not even for the applicant. No administrative stay while the permit is in court. I ask the members of the committee to support this amendment, and I'd like to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Green from Texas to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank my colleague from Colorado for yielding to me and working with me on the legislation. As Mr. Gardner said, this amendment makes several technical changes to improve the bill, and one important clarifying change that ensures that the legislation reflects our intent, which is to limit the expedited review process to exploration permits that are temporary and especially time-sensitive in nature. Our goal, and a goal I'd hope all our colleagues on the committee would share, was make the system work. EPA needs to have a permit approval system in place that is predictable, workable, and understandable. That's why this legislation, we have mirrored the EPA OCS air permitting process with the air permitting process employed by the Department of Interior in the Gulf of Mexico. By doing this, we can rest assured we have a strong offshore air permitting process, but that these projects are not left in limbo like we've seen with the EPA in recent years. Finally, the Jobs and Energy Permitting Act is just the type of legislation our committee should be working on. This bill is designed to increase energy production by creating a regulatory certainty which our companies desperately need to have. And I want to thank Mr. Gardner's staff and the majority staff for working with us on the proposal and ensure it narrowly is targeted and tightly crafted. The amendment improves the discussion draft, and I encourage my colleagues to support it. I look forward to continue work to strengthen the bill and see it advance. And I yield back my time, or yield back to my colleague.
Does anyone seek recognition in opposition to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I have no objections to some components of this amendment, but I have serious concern about others. Many of the changes in this amendment are technical in nature or clarify the intent of the bill's language. For example, this amendment acknowledges that the company applying for an air permit may not be able to measure air quality impacts, making modeling of potential impacts appropriate and necessary. That makes sense to me. This amendment limits the scope of Section 4 of the bill to exploration permits only, narrowing the applicability of some of the most troubling aspects of this bill is extremely helpful. But this still leaves a bill that would dramatically restrict public participation on exploration permits and increase litigation on this very same such permits. This amendment also explicitly eliminates the most effective federal forum for reviewing permit decisions, the Environmental Appeals Board. The amendment states that the EAP has no authority to review air quality permits for offshore exploration. As the EPA testified before this committee, it is faster and less burdensome to resolve disputes over permit decisions before the board rather than in court. The board also has extensive technical expertise and provides consistency in rulings because it reviews EPA's onshore air permit decisions as well. While I oppose cutting EAB out of the process, I will not raise an objection to this amendment, as the underlying bill also would have effectively eliminated EAB's review by leaving no time for such review in the permit process. With that, I yield back.
The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes in support of the amendment. I know some people who've been opposed to this legislation were making the argument that we basically were going to try to eliminate the Environmental Appeals Board in all cases at EPA. And while some of us, including myself, would support that, I think that this amendment of this discussion draft that Mr. Green and Mr. Gardner are submitting makes it very clear that we're only eliminating the Environmental Appeals Board specifically on the exploratory drilling permits, so that it will remain intact for other permitting authorities. The gentleman from Colorado, I'd be happy to yield additional time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd also like to point out that there are ample opportunities for the public to comment on these permits. I believe there's 4 additional comment opportunities during the NEPA process associated with the lease sale itself. There's comment periods on the permit, and so there's ample opportunity for public input and discussion. And again, when it comes to the EAB board itself, anybody who wears robes to the hearing and files briefs and arguments, I'd say that is litigation, and so that's what the EAB is doing right now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does anyone else seek recognition to speak for or against the...
Mr. Chairman, all we're trying to do, though, is to have the same regulatory regimen, whether it's with the EPA in other parts of the country or the Department here in the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay. Well, that concludes all debate on this. Are there any amendments to this discussion draft?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Will the clerk report the amendment?
What's the number, sir?
You know the number?
Amendment number 3.
Rush Amendment number 3.
An amendment to the discussion draft offered by Mr. Rush.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to speak and to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, the amendment that I'm offering today would strengthen the bill by ensuring that we maintain an opportunity for community input, even as we seek to streamline the permitting process, as this bill attempts to do. My amendment will allow the EPA administrator to provide an additional 30-day extension if the administrator determines that such time is necessary to meet the requirements of Section 4 to provide adequate time for public participation or to ensure sufficient involvement by any affected state. Mr. Chairman, input by those most affected by drilling is a vital and necessary part of the permitting process. There was a time when my colleagues on the other side of the aisle valued local community and states' rights. And now in this bill, as with other bills, bill after bill, my Republican friends are doing everything in their power to strip away the power of states and local communities to even provide input into the decision that will affect them the most. Mr. Chairman, as representative of the people, I do not believe that it makes sense for us to legislate away the ability of our citizens to comment on drilling decisions that will impact their health, their livelihoods, or their well-being. And I don't think that our constituents would buy the argument put forth by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that we must make it easier for oil companies to drill, to take away the public's ability to comment for the public's own benefit. This will repeal the Environmental Appeals Board, and in the original draft would only allow the drilling company, not states or average citizens, to seek administrative review. And by the way, if my Republican colleagues hadn't seen how preposterous this provision sounded and voted to repeal it, then I had an amendment drafted that would have done it for them. Mr. Chairman, I really believe that it's imperative that the communities at stake have an important role in the process of awarding permits, and this amendment will ensure that adequate time is given for this purpose. I don't believe that we should sacrifice the interests of average Americans in order to expedite the interests of oil companies, so that I hope that all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will support this amendment. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Anyone seek recognition in opposition to the amendment? The gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, the purpose of this bill, the purpose of the amendment, was to make sure that we are ending this constant ping pong through the EAB, back to EPA, back to EAB, and trying to actually move forward on job creation and energy security in this country. The language of the amendment adds a very critical word. It says extensions, which is basically a 30 days, 30 days, 30 days, on and on and on. however long they decide to go. There's no end time. So this actually takes what could be a very productive bill moving forward with construction, moving forward with development as soon as Congress intends, and turn it into a even more infuriating delay of 5, 6 years and beyond, 30 days at a time. And so I think that I would urge members to vote no on the amendment simply for the reason that when Congress passed the bill in the first place, so when it passed the Clean Air Act to issue these permits, it said, look, let's move forward in a year. And the EPA has continued to ignore those requirements. This is a particularly unique circumstance in Alaska where you're dealing with drilling conditions in Alaska. I think we ought to get to work right away, starting to put people to work, starting to achieve energy security. And instead of creating an even longer delay period, let's pass the bill as amended without this amendment and get America back to work.
Thank you.
Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The Chair will recognize himself for just one comment in opposition to this amendment. We were talking about the public participation, and I do think it's important to recognize that this legislation proposed draft does not in any way change the public comment periods on EPA-issued air permits for the public at large or for states. That's untouched. And in addition to that, the public has the opportunity to participate in up to 4 additional comment periods under NEPA, the NEPA process. So I do believe that there is adequate time for public participation and do not believe that the discussion draft would deny that in any way.
Would the gentleman yield for 1 minute?
Yield to the gentleman.
I would just also add that in the hearing on this bill, the executive director of the tribal council testified in support of this bill and understood that there was already a multitude of public input given. And so I think you can make a credible argument that the local folks are very supportive of the direction in which we're heading. And I yield back.
I control the time, and I will yield back my time. Are there additional anyone seek recognition in support of the gentleman's amendment? Seeing none, at this time I'll call for a vote on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. In favor? Aye. Those opposed, nay. No. In my opinion, I would say the nays have this, Mr. Rush. Thank you. Well, the amendment has been denied. So at this time, are there further amendments to the discussion draft?
Mr. Chairman, I actually just want to announce or say to you, because I do have an amendment at the desk, but I've decided I'll wait to bring it up at the full committee.
Okay.
We'll have more members present then.
Well, then I assume...
Especially on my side of the aisle.
Yeah. Are there any additional amendments on our side of the aisle? Well, in that case, we've completed our... I've been told that Mr. Markey may have an amendment.
One other amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, no. I can't wait to hear this. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Thank you for the warm welcome, and thank all of you for giving me the courtesy of making the amendment. I have an amendment at the desk, D10.
Clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment to the discussion draft offered by Mr. Markey.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. The underlying legislation represents another attempt by the Republicans to gut the Clean Air Act after Shell spent years changing its mind about how it wanted to drill and even what sea it planned to drill in. The air permit it was granted by EPA earned a grade of incomplete from EPA's Environmental Appeals Board after it was challenged. Rather than showing its work, Shell lobbyists instead essentially claimed that the dog ate its homework and requested legislative changes to force EPA to grade its air emissions on a curve. This bill will exclude as much as 98% of the air emissions from OCS oil drilling activities from even being counted by EPA as part of the permitting process. This bill will change the way in which the impacts of emissions are measured in a way that guarantees that more toxic pollution will be allowed. This bill will require each permit application to be graded before EPA has had enough time to review it. So air permit applications that would have once received a failing grade on the grounds that they would endanger health and the environment will now pass with flying colors under this new grade inflation scheme. But what will fail as a result of our ability to curb harmful air toxic pollution from drilling activities, this legislation exempts the emissions from all drilling support vessels, from icebreakers to the drilling ship itself as it moves towards the site, from counting as part of the air permitting process. What that means is that up to 98% of the total air emissions associated with Arctic OCS drilling won't even be counted. Now, at our hearing on this bill 2 weeks ago, Bob Myers, who led EPA's Air Office during the Bush administration, pointed out that, in fact, EPA can and does regulate icebreakers and other support vessels under Title II of the Clean Air Act. He said that this is why these vessels' emissions could be exempted from being counted during the air permitting process. Now, my amendment simply follows up on Mr. Myers' observations. It says that any air permit for OCS drilling can exempt the emissions from icebreakers or any other oil drilling support vessels as long as those vessels meet the most stringent Title II Clean Air Act regulations that are in place. It's a simple amendment, and it seems to me that it should be easily supported, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Does anyone seek recognition in opposition to his amendment? The gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with all simple amendments, there is much greater detail to be discussed. Basically, what we have here is an amendment that mixes and remixes two of the concepts that we were trying to address in the bill, dealing with both stationary and mobile sources, by requiring any service ships that do not meet the most strict requirements of Title II to be treated as a stationary source, apply best available control technology. And so, in effect, the service vessels for offshore drilling operations are best compared to delivery trucks at a factory. So if somebody is taking a truck to a factory or a train that's delivering it, in your case, the story used this morning, delivering goods to a refinery, power plant, or other stationary source of emissions, delivery trucks are not regulated as stationary sources under the Clean Air Act, but they are regulated as mobile sources. Similarly, the Clean Air Act and EPA regulations do not allow marine vessels to be regulated as stationary sources, but they are regulated as mobile sources. Even the Environmental Appeal Board agrees on this point. The other concern that I have in relation to the amendment is the effect that it could have on some of our international agreements. By extending domestic requirements to vessels that would otherwise be regulated by the United States Coast Guard under MARPOL. The U.S. is an active party to MARPOL treaty and works through its procedures in our regulation of foreign flag ships. We are working on an emissions control area through MARPOL right now that will impose additional requirements in certain U.S. waters, but this could possibly hurt and damage the U.S. efforts by possibly inserting the EPA into the regulation of MARPOL regulated vessels, and might actually be contrary to our obligations as a party. And so concerns that I have based on significant international issues, as well as the fact that we're mixing stationary and mobile sources, 2 points that we tried to clarify in the bill. Yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. Does anyone seek recognition Gentleman from Washington State's recognized for 5.
Yeah, I just speak in favor of the amendment. You know, it basically is trying to maintain some degree of fair health assessment of these pollutants in the Arctic. And it seems to me, since we're destroying the Arctic ecosystem and environment with the use of fossil fuels with their associated pollution, it would be a little bit of an irony to remove the vestige of protection against pollutants in the very place that we're destroying. This is just a small way to say we shouldn't go down that road, and we shouldn't make the Arctic a free fire zone for pollution when that's the reason it's disappearing. The Arctic ice, according to the scientific community, is going to be gone in a decade or two in September, which, you know, shouldn't bother anyone here except the fact that the Arctic ice is our air conditioner. And if you want to know what that means, in about a month or two, turn off your air conditioner, because that's what we're doing with the planet right now. We're turning off the thing that regulates the Earth's temperature, which is the Arctic ice cap, which is going to be gone in a few decades in the fall. Now, I'm making this statement. It's a fairly bold one. I just wanted to yield to anyone on the Republican side who can tell us what is happening to the Arctic ice sheet and why. If there's an alternative theory as to why the Arctic ice sheet is disappearing and an alternative explanation what that's going to do to the climatic system of the planet, I would be happy to yield for anyone who has an explanation.
Would the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
I would yield if you would explain how the fossil fuels that are under the Arctic ice cap originally got there. And what was the climatic conditions that encouraged the fossil fuel-like nature to be up there, and obviously then over the generations decay, overlap, and develop in very much a different climatic environment than there is today?
I think, as always, Mr. Shimkus's comments are very insightful, because I think you've led to the exact point I'm trying to make. If you believe your constituents in your great district are happy to say we're going to embrace a policy that will allow the Earth to end up back in the climatic regime that existed during those days, that's where we're headed. And I think your point is very well taken. We have had hugely dramatic different climates on the planet, but I can tell you, I suspect if you put it to a vote in our districts, people are not going to want to say that's the climatic system they want to get when you had swamps at the North Pole in uninhabitable parts of the regions. Ours may be one of them. And that's the problem. That's where we're heading. We don't know exactly what it is,
So if
but it's
Chairman would
different.
yield,
Sure.
so you do accept the premise that there at one time there was no ice caps?
Yeah, I assume that's the case, and how, you know, the plate tectonics may explain the presence of some of these previous vegetable-rich areas that may have migrated north. I don't know my plate tectonics well enough, but I do know the Earth has had very, very significant different systems, many of which would be wholly displeasurable to the way we live. And I'm suggesting that it is not a wise course for us to cause a climate change regime to remove the Arctic ice cap with unforeseen consequences and then turn around and reduce our regulatory system against pollutions. And that's what we're doing here in this bill. Mr. Markey's is a very, very small improvement to try to prevent that. And I would just say I think this is one of the most interesting discussions we've had since I've been on this committee. Yes.
I thank the gentleman for you. I just want to get into this vegetation issue in the North Pole, because I think it's a very important one. And see, the majority's trying to have it both ways. They're kind of carnivorous vegetarians, you know, contradiction in terms. You can't have it both ways. So you can't say on the one hand that they don't have to meet the mobile source standards for pollution, and then say at the same time they don't have to meet the stationary standards for pollution. It's either one or the other. It's either mobile or it's stationary. Pick one, because pollution is being created. So it's like, you know, carnivorous vegetarian. You can't be mobile stationary and be exempted. It's like Salt Lake City nightlife, okay? Pick one or pick the other. You can't have both, okay, at the same time. So that's your dilemma here right now. You got to pick one category because you're exempting them from both, and that's essentially why this is going to escalate as a debate that we have in the committee. I thank the gentleman for you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair is going to recognize himself for 5 minutes, and I want to ask the council a couple of questions here. This amendment does seem to mix up the concepts of stationary and mobile sources under the Clean Air Act. And just for clarification, these support vessels that are providing support to platforms, are the emissions considered as a part of the stationary platform emissions?
Yes, they are. Their emissions count towards the emissions of the OCS source, so they are regulated as part of the OCS source in that way.
Okay, so they are included.
Yes.
But this amendment would, in essence, treat them as treat the vessels as stationary sources.
Yes, unless the vessel met the strictest requirements under Title II, then they would be required to be regulated as a stationary source.
And so they would come under the prevention of significant deterioration?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yeah, yield to the
And it's also my understanding that my colleague from Massachusetts is very sneaky in that he's changing the language for any versus under Title II, only new vessels, so that any vessel would then have to meet these more stringent standards versus what was the intent of the law, which was new.
That's correct. Title II generally had a policy. It generally has a policy for new vessels, especially ocean-going vessels, and what this would require, presumably for those vessels that are older, they would have to meet this. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to service OCS sources. So that's correct.
I yield back my time.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield to me also?
Yes, I yield to John.
How many stationary drilling platforms and mobile source service vehicles do we expect to be in this area if this bill becomes law?
There is, there's one Shell's, for the Alaska OCS and the current Shell program, it is one drilling vessel.
One.
And they are seeking, and they are
one, not 100, not 1,000.
No,
one.
One.
And how many service vessels would serve that one?
There's one primary one, the icebreaker, and then there are a few additional.
A few.
Right.
A few is a small number.
Yes.
So one platform, a handful of vessels, and my friends on the other side say that's going to upset the climate balance and the environment in the Arctic Ocean. Is that right? How many cars go through the Boston Tunnel every day?
Mr. Markey might be able to answer that one, but I'm not exactly sure.
Would it be several thousand?
It would be many.
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 I will postulate that there's more potential environment, and I'm not saying there is, because I know all those folks that drive back and forth through the Boston Tunnel probably all drive electric vehicles and don't consume gasoline, but the potential for environmental emissions is probably greater in Mr. Markey's district on a daily basis than it is on a decade basis in the Arctic if we pass this bill.
Well, yes, and obviously also for exploration permits, it's important to keep in mind that the activity is 30 to 45 days, so it's not even over years in the Arctic. It's very limited duration.
Yeah, but I do not think Mr. Markey is sneaky. I think he's up front. I think he is providing a service to this committee by putting this amendment in so that we can debate it, and he is a paragon of legislative accomplishment. And with that, I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. Does anyone else seek recognition to speak for or against the Markey Amendment? Seeing no one seeking recognition, at this time we'll vote on the Markey Amendment. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the Markey Amendment is defeated. Are there further amendments? If there are no further amendments, the question now occurs on favorably reporting the bill as amendment, the discussion draft as amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. We will now move back to the consideration of the train bill to dispose of amendments. Yeah, we've always voted. We've always voted it. To refresh everyone's memory, we had 3 amendments before we, after we came back. There was the Sullivan Amendment, the Rush Amendment, and the Capps Amendment. So first we'll vote on the Sullivan Amendment, which was striking Section 5 of the bill. That's the $2 million authorization. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. We will now consider the Rush Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. We will now consider the Capps Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. We will now vote on favorably reporting the bill to the full committee as amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported to the full committee. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill approved by the subcommittee today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. The chair thanks all the members and the staff, and the subcommittee stands adjourned subject to the call of the chair.